Gosh, management theories in education to help us with ICT. Well, my first thought is that are there any management theories? I've often argued that management runs with fashion and fancy, and then, I read a paper the other day saying there were theories of management fashion. No, that's academics for you. Come on now, if we're going to look for management theories, let's start with something simple. Let's start with Management 101. Did you ever go to Management 101? Everybody teaching Management 101 has got one of these slides where it says, think, act, I beg your pardon. It says think, plan, act, and check, 4 stages. And then if you think about those 4 stages in managing ICT in education, we can start to make some sense of things, because if we think about applying ICT into education, there are all sorts of issues to do with it. It's complex, but the one thing that I often remind myself about is Bloom's taxonomy. At one level, we need to be able to read and remember what we have read, very basic stuff. At the other end of the education scale, we need to be able to evaluate and conceptualize what it is that we are not just reading about, but thinking about. And so if you think about the application of ICT at the several levels of Bloom's taxonomy, a lot of things start to come clear. And the contribution of technology to reading and remembering, well, we know quite a lot about that. I think the way that technology helps us to conceptualize, that's a different issue. If you think about research, we use technology to do research and to do writing and to do a publication, but at conceptualizing and evaluating, we're just beginning to get into this, is my personal view. And then think about planning. Of course, if we're going to be doing planning for education, and if we agree that it's complex, one of the starting points is to acknowledge we're going to be dealing with change. And as soon as we're managing change, your stereotypical manager in education is really quite challenged. We all know there are champions who manage to make things happen, and they become quite famous locally, if not globally. But managing change is about managing with strategy. So I would appeal personally to the conventional books on strategic management and say, okay, so we're in education, but we're managers, and we need to think strategy. We need to understand something about strategy. And it's not just about SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's about thinking about the transitions we have to go through, thinking about the difference between strategic formulation and strategic implementation of ideas. We can't deal with it now, but there's a lot of stuff we can read in the conventional management theories. And then there's the acting. To inculcate change in education, we probably really need to pick up on the project management skills. There's work by Cliff Bowman and Sergio Pellegrinelli. It goes back many, many years. But they were early proponents of the idea that managing change and the implementation of strategy demands project management. And they also argued that it demanded project management from outside of the status quo, because people within the status quo won't do change. They'll talk about it, they'll say yes about it, but they won't do it. And I think there's some familiarity to the idea that the people within the system are the worst to persuade to change the system. And then checking, for me, checking what we have achieved through the introduction of technology. We could be just fishing around for good results, and we don't quite know what we're going to expect to achieve here. But surely we've now come after 10 years, 20 years, 30 years playing with technology in education. We've come to the point that we can actually see the need to negotiate the benefits. It's all about the stakeholders, because if we're looking at management theory, a great management theory is that the stakeholder is somebody who can screw up your business, or a stakeholder is somebody who could make your business succeed. And if you don't manage stakeholders properly, now that in education goes way beyond teachers and learners. It goes beyond principals, it goes beyond school governing boards, it goes right through to parents and to the community and to the policymakers. And in education, it's so diverse, isn't it? There are so many stakeholders. Yeah, you hint at the pace of change. The change is a word I've just been using. And the rate of change is problematic, isn't it? Because technology changes every 2 weeks. And education needs at least a year to think about it. But come on, educational planning is based on an academic year. So at the level of the program, curriculation, and hiring and firing, and we are on an annual cycle, which is a lot more tortuous than many businesses who can work on a weekly cycle, perhaps. However, at the level of learning itself, the timescales are measured in very short units, seconds, minutes, and days. Therefore, the need to synchronize what happens in that very short time scale with what's going on in the very long time scale is problematic. One of the recent papers I read, which was helpful here, is by Yoongjin, let me look at my notes, Yoongjin Yu, who's from Temple University in the USA. He published an interesting paper in NISQ, and it's not about education, but he picks on the impact of the modern technologies on systems and systems thinking and organizations. And I found what he wrote very interesting, because he talked about the complexities of things like, we're talking about the social web and Facebook and stuff. He talked about this in 4 senses, and he identifies 4 areas that we need to pay attention to. There is space and there is time. Then he says there are the actors who are involved, and then there are the artifacts that the actors are using. Now, it all sounds pretty obvious, doesn't it? But when you go through what these 4 things give us, in education, it's all hot stuff. These are the challenges that managers are going to have to deal with. Let's just look at them briefly. Space, space is no boundary anymore. Space is no limitation. We're not looking for classrooms anymore, we're looking for bandwidth. If we look at education for our children, we're all thinking much more internationally and globally than locally. I guess there's an anxiety to preserve local culture, but then there's an anxiety for children to learn about other cultures. How confused do our children get? I wonder. So space is talking about how education becomes a global phenomenon. And certainly where I live, in South Africa, there are many children, just in 2 little villages nearby where I live, many children who are privileged enough to have parents who are giving them home schooling. And this is not just giving them a book to read, this is a fully managed, on the web, 5 hours a day, all to a schedule, with examinations at the end of the trail. And I would expect this mode of breaking out from the conventional school is going to become much more common, widespread. How it might happen in the middle layers between the privilege and the disadvantage, I don't know. I just don't know. However, the time thing, well, we know about the time thing. Education timescales are being very compressed. The attention span is so short, was it? Not always, but we talk about how kids can only concentrate for 2.5 minutes now. The timescales for the material that we use. People expect the look and feel of material to be fashionable again. What we expect to see on the screen changes. And when we've got the same textbook we had last year, boring, can't we jimmy this up a little bit? So timescales become much more important. And I guess we're all much more concerned to know what happened yesterday or even this morning. And a lot of education is going to be concerned with very recent trends rather than with something that was printed in a book 20 years ago. So that's space and that's time. And the actors, I mentioned stakeholders, and I think the stakeholder analysis is something that educators or educational managers have to take on board. Because in making a success of technology in education, we've got to serve the needs of the stakeholders, otherwise they'll screw us. Otherwise we're putting ourselves at risk. Um, Finding a compromise between stakeholders who want X and stakeholders who want Y, and prioritising everything, becomes a question of judging the power and the influence that an individual stakeholder group has over a school or a university. And so stakeholder analysis is a management technique. I wouldn't call it a theory particularly. It's a technique that's very, very useful to have up your sleeve when you're beginning to make for big change. So the actors who we're dealing with can be thought of as stakeholders, and management theory helps us there. Finally, the artifacts, well, in a sense we've been there because we're talking, we're talking about Facebook and Twitter. We haven't got started yet with the technologies that are bearing upon our world of education and our world of living today. But it's not just the tools we use, it's not just the cell phone and the netbook and the tablet and the whatnot. It's also the technological artifacts that kids now produce. We're only just beginning the debate about whether we should teach children in school to write with a pencil, because what they will need to do is type with a keyboard. So the typed work that we are increasingly happy to get from our students because we can read it is hardly common practice yet. Is it? Certainly university examinations, in my recent experience, it's all about writing stuff in a script book, and some poor examiner has to read this and make sense of it. So the artifacts that kids produce, and it goes right through to videos, photographs, talking with a pre-primary school teacher in the USA. It was all about the iPads in the classroom, allowing pre-primary children to take photographs, to photo booth them, and to send them around the world to share their artifacts of their education with people they'd never met, but with whom they were in communication. So I think Yu's work helps us, and we need to unpack the complexity in this sort of way. Yes, well, Yu's ideas are simplistic, and you could say we know a lot of this already, but the truth is we've got to take very complex managerial situations and deal with them, and we do that by breaking big things down, complicated things down, into parts, reductionism. I'm reminded suddenly of Stafford Beer, not new work at all, but Stafford Beer and his law of requisite variety. That's worth a quick Google, because Stafford Beer simply articulated that if the problem is this complex, then the solution must be this complex. The variety in the problem must be matched by the variety in the solution, and any difference will leave us short of a good solution. So complexity is indeed a factor. Picking on Yu's work, because I did enjoy reading that paper, he skips around the one thing that brings the simplicity of his four ideas together in one place. And the thing he skips around is the idea of the process. Because when we're looking at technology on the one hand, and the objectives of an organization on the other hand, these things come together in the processes of education. And it's not just what happens in the classroom anymore. It's all of the processes in all parts of education. So we could run through the life cycle of a student and say there's dealing with potential student inquiries. Marketing, good gracious, do we market schools? Yes, we do. And then there's registration and induction, and then there's teaching, and there's learning, and there's, did I skip over curriculation? Did I skip over pedagogy? Did I skip over the design of our learning? And we push on, and then we're assessing the students, and we're examining the students, we're graduating the students, and suddenly there's some kind of aftercare. The role of past learners and past students in successfully sustaining schools and other educational institutions becomes more and more important as time goes on. Certainly at tertiary level, the failure to manage the alumni is such a stupid thing. It's so obvious that people who have been to your institution and should be proud of it. Getting off the point a little bit, but there's a whole life cycle. Then there's a life cycle to programs. How do we invent new programs and design them? There's a life cycle to the evaluation and adoption of technologies. So the process for me is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we have to see the complexity of the space and the time and the actor and the artifact. These are the things that mix and melt in the process to produce success. Without the process, we'll never have success. And so that's where the real particular difficulties come to our notice and have to be dealt with. And there's one other aspect which confuses things, of course, as we're thinking about simplicity. I'm worried that we're taking too simplistic approach. I read as much research as I can, but I find that so much research ignores differences. And so difference is the word I'm using a lot with my students, where people go into school and look at how teachers teach, but they don't take account of the differences amongst the teachers, you know. Young researchers are so keen to get their demographics, you know. Look at a teacher. How old are you? What's your highest level of education? And all of this stuff. But come on, what kind of person is this teacher? Is this teacher a highly motivated individual or a lowly motivated individual? Are they looking forward to a long career in teaching and working on it? Or do they want to get the hell out and get a job somewhere else that would be, in their view, easier to do? Huge differences in the teachers. There are differences in the learners. There are differences in the subjects. How can we look at educational effort in a school and look at how technology contributes without running across all of the subjects, which are so very different the one from another, and where the contribution of technology is going to be so different? Think about the differences between learning a language, you know, what the language laboratory comes to mind, and learning geography, where we've got Google Earth and Google Maps and all sorts of instant information about the different parts of the world. It is so different from one subject to another. And so the differences that we find in all senses is what worries me. And when we come to technology in particular, so much of the investment that we've made in recent history has been in the administration of educational institutions. You look at universities, and a lot of the initial investment was simply in payroll and human resource management. You know, the same sort of trick that was pulled in business, where we can only spend this $1 million if it's going to save us $1.5 million, and so we're looking for efficiency and effectiveness. Now, that's moving on now. So I think the benefits of not just saving money, but delivering better education are beginning to be realized. The problem is that people don't yet quite admit, and certainly don't know how to deal with, the fact that what education is changing. We're beginning to recognize that a lot of what kids learn, and even older people learn, doesn't come from their formal learning at all. It comes from outside. And so life is one continual lesson. And so in making the best of the formal parts of education, we increasingly have to take account of the informal learning that goes on. And then when we look at the web, the social web, and the way that people now interact, and cell phones and stuff, it's not about the administration of education anymore. It's about the integration, I think, the integration insofar as we can integrate all these different things. It's the differences in these things that are going to get you.